You're listening to the Voice of Russia from the heart of London. On weekdays, we broadcast live from 4 p.m. until 8. We'll bring you news, current affairs, features and debate. You can listen to us on digital radio and online. Visit ruvr.co.uk.
Welcome back. You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. Benjamin Netanyahu may be keeping his job as Prime Minister after Israel went to the polls, but his Likud-Beitenu alliance has lost a quarter of its seats in the parliament, or Knesset. With coalition talks still ongoing, his does remain the largest grouping, with 31 seats, but it was a sharp drop from the previous total of 42 for the two parties. Mr. Netanyahu has offered to work with the newly formed Yesh Atid party, which shocked observers by coming second with 19 seats. However, its leader, the former TV presenter Yair Lapid, has demanded reform of a law under which ultra-Orthodox Jewish seminary students can defer military service. The thing is that religious parties in the current governing coalition are strongly opposed to any such changes. This election campaign was marked by a strong showing by the nationalist right party of Habayit HaYehudi, the Jewish Home Party, with its charismatic leader Naftali Bennett, who was most associated with the settler movement. But what kind of government has the election in Israel produced? Is it one that can respond to unhappiness that brought 500,000 people onto the streets in protest against its economic policies? Or will it be a government that will do its utmost to increase control over the occupied Palestinian territories? Well, to discuss this and issues surrounding the election, I'm joined in our London studio by Rachel Shabi, who's a journalist and author of the book, Not the Enemy, Israel's Jews from Arab Lands. A warm welcome to you, Rachel. We'll be joined very soon by our bureaus in Moscow and in Washington. But I'd just like to get your view initially, Rachel. The horse trading is going on at the moment. Netanyahu, he obviously will stay Prime Minister. But what did you make of the day? We were expecting perhaps the most right-wing coalition in the country's history. That hasn't quite happened, has it?
No, it hasn't. All the polls, as well as all the analysts just days before the election, were predicting that there would be a much higher percentage of seats allocated to the right and far right parties. And in fact, it was less than expected, in part because there was a higher turnout of voters in areas that are traditionally not supporters of the right and far right, which in itself, in turn, might have been the result of a ad campaign really encouraging the centre-left to go out and vote, as they were identified as the particular proportion of the electorate that were particularly despondent and apathetic about voting. But that all being said, it does look like, there is a sort of deceptive prescription of the Israeli Knesset as being split between the left and the far right. And in fact, it's just split between the right and the even further right. And so we are still likely to end up with a coalition that is more far right. Certainly it will have more of a percentage of very settler-friendly politicians than was the case the last time round, and is still likely to maintain a very consistent position on the occupied Palestinian territories, which is, to keep them occupied and to keep expanding Jewish settlements. But
on the issue of right and far right, and I take your point that it's difficult to sort of see a left-wing party in all of this. But I mean, is political discourse in Israel, doesn't that stop or preclude any kind of leftist tendencies, given that maybe politicians, they pay lip service to a two-state solution, but when it comes down to it, they don't want to be branded leftist and rendered irrelevant, I suppose?
It's true that left-wing has become, practically an insult in Israel these days. But I do think that part of the responsibility for that does lie with the Israeli left wing itself, in that it has failed to show any of the kind of substance and left wing ideals that might galvanize any kind of meaningful support around it. It doesn't really have any credibility when it comes to, certainly not to the two-state solution, which it is responsible as much as any other party for torpedoing, and certainly not when it comes to, properly left-wing right-wing economic policy of the sort that Israelis seem to be asking for today, particularly when, 500,000 of them turn up on the streets protesting at, very savage neoliberal economy of Netanyahu's coalition. And
it was the newspaper Haaretz which made the point, I think, that this election would be fought on economic policies more than anything else. Would you agree with that? Do you think that is what we've seen in the results and so far it's coming out this week?
I'm not really sure what it was fought on or if it was fought on anything. I mean, it really seemed to be a very kind of apathetic election, one where the public was swayed more by, brand new personalities that appeared cool or modern or different, rather than any sort of substance behind those candidates. That would certainly appear to be the case with Yair Lapid of the Yesh Atid party, who has suddenly from nowhere got 19 seats. It's also true of Naftali Bennett of the Habayit Yehudi party, who, whatever his policy, was seen as this kind of new politician. And that it seemed to be more about that than about any sort of a specific policy that any party was discussing with any sense of meaning or integrity in the campaign.
Could you argue, Naftali Bennett, some of the things he said were quite explosive, I suppose, but he did kind of tap into a sentiment that was shared among young Israelis, I suppose, because here we had a self-made man, a man who made his millions, and perhaps at a time when Israelis are looking for some kind of, young Israelis in their 20s and 30s, for instance, they're looking for some kind of role model. It so happened that he had the support, but they were kind of interested in the way that he was a self-made man, and that perhaps he offered a vision that maybe the status quo didn't.
I think that was a significant part of the appeal about him, that he did seem like this real kind of successful high-tech guy. And Israel, that's the dream, right? To be a successful high-tech person. That's the aspiration. That's the self-image that Israel has of itself, not unreasonably. It is a very advanced high-tech economy. But that would be part of his appeal. But as it turns out, Habayit Yehudi did a lot worse than people expected. It did well, just not as well as the polls predicted. And I suspect that when it came down to it, people weren't that interested in voting for a party that just kept going on about settlers and settlement expansion, particularly at a time when people have economic concerns.
Well, we'll cross now to our bureau in Washington and Rob Sachs with his guest.
Thanks so much, Brendan. I'm here with Dan Arbel. He is a scholar in residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at American University. He's a 25-year veteran of the Israeli Foreign Service, serving in senior posts overseas in the United States and in Japan. Dan Arbel, welcome.
Good morning.
So listening to the conversation there, a lot to parse out, but I wanted to ask you what Yair Lapid and his kind of foray now into the Knesset is going to do for Benjamin Netanyahu. Many are saying it's going to make him have to be more moderate and may change the tone of these Israeli-Palestinian talks. What do you make of it?
And absolutely, Yair Lapid yesterday became a kingmaker, putting to rest different rumors and speculations that he might opt for a center-left bloc to try and block Prime Minister Netanyahu from forming a government. Yesterday, he clearly signaled that he sees Netanyahu as the future Prime Minister. And in the context of when they sit down and talk about the issues, Yair Lapid is going to try and promote the agenda that brought him the popularity, the 19 seats, and that agenda mainly focused on domestic issues and social economic issues, and the issue that was mentioned earlier on the revising the Tal law, which administers the drafting of the ultra-religious young men into the military. Yair Lapid is a believer in the two-state solution and has a softer position on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but that was not the main issue in his campaign. Clearly, if and when he joins the Netanyahu government, I believe that he will be bringing in a softer tone, a more flexible approach. I know already we've seen today reports that the Palestinian Authority has invited him to come and visit, and he's stirred some hopes in the region that perhaps the fact that he joins the Netanyahu coalition government, he will be able to bring to a change. So I think that in the guidelines of the new cabinet that will be formed, perhaps there will be a softer approach. I do agree with Ms. Shabi that remains to be seen whether in practice the new government that will be formed will actually show flexibility when it comes to negotiations with the Palestinians, when it comes to the issue of the settlements policy.
Well, also on the issue of settlements, this has been a key part in where the United States and Israel have parted ways. The United States saying this has to stop. Prime Minister Netanyahu forging ahead, especially after Palestinians upgraded their status with the UN, calling for more. Do you think this could change, and how do you think that dynamic between the United States and Israel is going to shape up for the next few years?
The United States and Israeli relations have been are strong, deep, long-standing, and go beyond a certain leader here or there throughout the years. Deep bonds between the peoples, between the leaderships, and many mutual interests and challenges that both countries face. There's areas of cooperation, vast cooperation and agreement on one hand. On the other hand, there are issues that Israel and the U.S. agree to disagree, and have been so for many years. The issue of settlements has never been popular among U.S. presidents, administrations, going back to the Carter administration in the 70s. Until now, for 40 years, U.S. stated policy was always that settlements are either an obstacle or not contributing or illegal. Different terminologies were used. And this is an issue that I believe will continue to be an issue of disagreement between the U.S. and Israel. It remains to be seen how the incoming administration, how the Obama administration, its second term, will be dealing with this issue. They have been signaling in recent weeks that they're going to go back to the drawing board and try to move this process forward. We'll have to see what formula they come up with. I think that they're encouraged by the fact that people like Yair Lapid and Tzipi Livni may join a future government. The broader coalition there will be then creates perhaps in their view, in the U.S. view, more opportunities to promote these talks, negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. But I do sense that it will continue to be an issue discussed between the new Netanyahu government and the incoming Obama administration.
Well, I wanted to ask a similar question to our guest in Moscow, Eitan Weiss. He's the first secretary of the Israeli embassy in Russia. Welcome to you. And thinking about the relationship between Israel and Russia, we've seen some complexities there. On the one hand, a strengthening of economic ties, but still a lot of tension over the situation in Iran. Can you tell us about how Russia is viewing this new election?
Well, good evening, first of all. I believe that here in Russia, they, of course, viewing the situation in Israel very closely and anticipating what will be, let's say, tomorrow. I do believe that no matter which government will basically rise in Israel, the good ties with Russia will, of course, continue. And, of course, we will always welcome Russia's opinion on the situation in the Middle East. And, of course, Russia is a very important ally to us and as a member of the quartet. And I do believe that time will say, basically, whether or not the new Israeli government would be able to continue let's say, the conditions and the relations with Russia, which, as you said, were increasingly getting better, of course, on the economic sphere and also on other issues that are at hand. Of course, President of Russian Federation, Mr. Vladimir Putin's visit to Israel really showed that the good ties with Russia will continue, I think, no matter what.
I'd just like to bring in our guest here in London, Rachel Shabi. I suppose, I mean, with regard to the two-state solution and Palestinians in particular, would they feel particularly disenfranchised by this election, or this isn't particularly surprising to them? I mean, their concerns over a two-state solution weren't really a factor in this election campaign. There's no surprise there, is there?
No, I mean, Palestinians I've spoken to have been completely unsurprised and, wearily pessimistic. Same, different government, same policy. They don't expect there to be any change whatsoever on the ground. Palestinians have told me that, Israeli bulldozers will continue to operate in the West Bank, as will all the infrastructure of the Israeli occupation. And the thing about this potential coalition that will form, there is this sort of tendency to hope that people like Yair Lapid will be a restraining influence on Netanyahu's right-wing coalition and bring about a return to the negotiation table, where in fact there's little evidence to suggest that might be the case. I mean, it seems that at best, and Yair Lapid will provide a sort of camouflage. He will be the friendly face of the occupation that will be portrayed to the international community as, the nice guy, the charismatic guy who softens Israel's real policy to the outside world. But in fact, everything he has said about the occupation has implied that, he's really not that interested in peace. I mean, just the fact that he could say that he expects Palestinians to get used to the idea that Jerusalem will remain united and eternally Jewish, and they need to give up on East Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state. I mean, this does not suggest to me a man who's remotely interested in reaching a peace solution with the Palestinians.
Could I get Dan Arbel's reaction to that? Yair Lapid, the softer face of Palestinian occupation and policies thereof.
It's a possible scenario. But following Lapid's campaign and the way he's been handling the issues since winning since gaining these 19 seats, he's shown some stubbornness, some strength, and he clearly stated that he does not plan to be a fig leaf for the Netanyahu government, for extreme right or far right wing policies. And so it remains to be seen as to how, in the context of him joining and promoting the issues dear to him on the domestic front, how he responds to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and how he influences, if he influences, the Netanyahu's policies. Ms. Shabi is presenting a scenario which is very likely, but one can argue that there may be perhaps different undercurrents, undertones that could perhaps contribute to a more constructive, more flexible approach by the new government.
I just wanted to follow up with you, Dan. We were talking a little bit earlier about the issue of Iran. And many people will remember that visual of Netanyahu standing up in the UN with that cartoon time bomb, the red line he drew to state it as clearly as possible where things stand with Israel's concern over Iran gaining nuclear capability. Where is that discussion today, and does this new coalition government change that discussion?
Well, it's a very good question. I believe that this issue of Iran was one of the main reasons for why, at the time, Netanyahu called for snap elections in October. What was surprising was the fact that during the campaign it was a hidden issue, hardly discussed during the days of the campaign, leading to and it wasn't a defining issue in the discourse, in the political discourse. But once the elections are now over, clearly this issue is going to come back and be on the top of Mr. Netanyahu's agenda. His speech at the UN with his red line drawing on that cartoon, allowing more time to deal with this issue, stating that spring or summer of 2013 those are foreseen estimated dates in which Iran may be crossing that red line of uranium enrichment. And so I believe that as we approach that time frame of spring and summer, it will become once again a very hot topic. And there, the U.S. and Israel will have to be in close contact on this issue, as they were in previous years. The P5+1 negotiations with Iran are not moving anywhere. Cannot even agree on a venue for meeting. The IAEA talks with Iran are also not moving forward, and it will definitely be time for some decisions, both in Jerusalem and in Washington, as to what to do with this Iran problem.
And just following up on that, on the Iran issue, I'd just like to ask our guest in Moscow, Eitan Weiss, who's the first secretary at the Israeli embassy there in Russia. I suppose it sounded like some would say that there was a bit of saber rattling last year on Netanyahu's part with regard to Iran. And given Russia's role in solving the Iran crisis, was it any surprise to you that perhaps Iran really wasn't that much of an issue for voters in Israel this week?
Well, something is quite difficult to understand which issue was, let's say, the main motivator for the voters in Israel. One must take in consideration that out of its 65 years of existence, Israel faced and still faces a lot of challenges, both within and without. And it's quite difficult to understand which part was Iran in this equation of the elections or not. I do believe that the results basically show the world exactly what the Israeli people want. They want, let's say, a wider spectrum of opinions in the Israeli Knesset, in the Israeli government. And I think that this represents all their wishes regarding both the Palestinians' peace process and, of course, Iran and all other issues that are at hand, both with our neighbors and with, of course, social issues within Israel boundaries itself. So again, I don't think that it's quite, let's say, easy to understand which issues affected the opinions of the voters in Israel.
And I'd just like to bring that to Rachel Shabi here in the London studio. I suppose maybe it's not that big a surprise that foreign policy issues are less important in an election in Israel. But how do you see the issue of Iran's enrichment program, its nuclear program, playing out under Netanyahu when he finally does do all the horse trading and come up with a coalition that he's happy with?
I think you're right that, it's no surprise that foreign policy doesn't feature when it comes to people going out to vote. What's interesting in Israel, though, is that it used to feature a lot more strongly, and it was notable in its absolute disappearance from the campaign this year. And I think that is down to, the absolute lack of faith that Israelis now have in the possibility of a peace solution with Palestinians. Again, I think the fault of successive governments who've managed to persuade the population that they have tried and failed, and that occupation is somehow possible to manage, as opposed to end it. And the fact that Israelis now seem to have swallowed this line by totally ignoring the subject and focusing on other things, I think is very worrying and, in the long term, very dangerous. As for Iran, it's quite interesting, because of course Netanyahu and his former defense minister Ehud Barak were going on about Iran non-stop right up into election time, and then suddenly stopped talking about it, which was really odd. You'd think if it was that important to Netanyahu, he would keep campaigning on that basis. And I do think the fact that he has hemorrhaged some support. It's definitely, he's come out with less seats in this election, is due to the fact that people just don't want to hear that anymore. It's a bit like, just stop going on about that.
But would part of that have been down to the fact that they were conscious of the US election and any kind of action against Iran, or whether it be verbal or whatever, needed backing from the US and Obama. Barack Obama was never going to give that in the run-up to a US election that he was trying to win.
It might have been partly to do with that. I think you're right. It might also have been down to just fatigue at being bullied into this position of perpetually being fearful and having to worry about, next month and the future for their children, just really having enough with a government that tries to browbeat them with existential angst for their every waking hour. So it might have been just a bit of fatigue with that as well, particularly because there seem to be far greater domestic concerns to be worried about. Again, the economic crisis, social issues, the cost of housing, food prices, dwindling paychecks, all these appear to be more important to Israelis than whatever Netanyahu has to say about Iran at the moment.
And do you think Netanyahu was giving adequate answers to those questions of economic problems and solutions to them as well?
Well, I think, his campaign did pay lip service to that issue. And he certainly passed some very populist measures in the last few months. I heard that he changed the terms, that we broke the monopoly for mobile phone companies in Israel, which is actually a really big deal. I mean, there used to be extortionate mobile phone contracts. And for a nation of, eternal talkers, it's actually quite a big move. So things like that, I think he was trying to appeal to the population. But I don't think that the population necessarily believes that he is interested in their interests and their welfare, particularly when it comes to social issues.
Netanyahu didn't do as well as was anticipated. He has had a drop in support. Would it be fair to say that this is because this is a lack of satisfaction at the way he ran his election campaign, or is it just that there's so many more players on the scene now that it split the vote too much?
Probably a combination of both. I mean, there were a lot of new players on the scene, and Israelis like new players on the scene. So, that accounted for a large percentage of the vote. But I think as well, Israelis aren't big fans of Netanyahu to begin with. They don't exactly like him, and they might dislike him for reasons that are different to why other people dislike him. But certainly, he did lose a lot of popularity in the last few months, especially the fact that he took Israel to war, in the Gaza crisis of late last year, for very little gain, as it turned out. I mean, it wasn't an election, it wasn't a move that won him any popularity. And then when he formed a sort of very opportunistic coalition for the election with Israeli-Palestinian, which was a coalition that, became apparent it would fragment after the election. It was just a pure vote consolidating platform. I mean, that actually just put a lot of people off, and people viewed it as a very cynical move. There have been various points like this over which Netanyahu has sort of bled popular support. And we can see that popular support has drifted either to Habayit Yehudi and Naftali Bennett, or to Yair Lapid and his Yesh Atid party.
Back to our bureau in Washington.
Thanks so much, Brendan. And I wanted to ask Dan Arbel, the scholar in residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at American University, a little bit more about the election. And one issue that came up that we mentioned before, that maybe here in the United States, people are like, what is this all about? Is this whole idea of having Orthodox practicing Jews, modern, get into the military. This was an issue that is pretty foreign to Americans, but was a real source of contention in Israel. And I wanted to ask you about this split maybe in Israeli society between ultra-Orthodox Jews, very religious Jews, and more moderate Jews, and how that plays into the swaying back and forth of the political tides.
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to relate to some comments made by Ms. Shabi about Netanyahu's surge in the polls. I think that Netanyahu's alliance with Mr. Lieberman created a situation in which he was perceived as the sure winner of this election, and by being the sure winner, it signaled to many people, probably potential supporters and voters, that they can perhaps choose a party of their liking. Since Netanyahu is going to be prime minister anyway, let us choose another party. And so it was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the alliance with Mr. Lieberman consolidated the victory and making sure that Netanyahu will be the next prime minister. On the other hand, it did hamper his efforts and did create a situation in which he received less votes. That's not to say that all that was mentioned before, that there was a lot of dissatisfaction from some of his policies, but that's on that issue. On the ultra-Orthodox religious Jews drafting into the military, it has been an issue of contention for many years. At the inception of the State of Israel, there was an agreement between Ben-Gurion and the leaders of the ultra-Orthodox community about exemption of 400 youngsters from military service. And that exemption, the number of those exempted grew and grew, and today we're talking about tens of thousands of ultra-religious youngsters that are exempt from military service. Of course, the ultra-religious parties are interested in maintaining that situation in which the ultra-religious youngsters should continue with their studies, with their education, with their rabbinical studies and all that they've been doing throughout the years, and not go, God forbid, into the military, while a growing number of secular Israelis, secular Jews, have called for burden sharing and more equal burden sharing, and the fact that a lot of the pressure is being put on a small group of Israelis that are doing both their regular army service and reserve duty. And so this has become one of the main issues of the campaign, an issue that the flag was raised both by Yair Lapid's party and by Naftali Bennett's party, and other secular parties who were calling for this for an amendment or a revision of the famous Tal law that took care of that at that time, was extended several times, each time for 5 more years. Finally, in August 1st of this year, of 2012, it has reached its end, and they're going to be looking at ways of dealing with the Tal law, of either coming up with a new arrangement or revising the law to take care of this disparity that exists.
Well, one more question for our Moscow guest, Eitan Weiss, the first secretary of the Israeli embassy in Russia. Looking ahead, looking at the policy agendas, we talked about what was mentioned on the campaign, but what do you think will be tackled first in the Knesset, and what do you think we could see moving forward on Benjamin Netanyahu's agenda in the coming months?
Well, before answering to that question, I would like to make some remarks on Ms. Shabi's, let's say, remarks earlier on. Now, regarding the Palestinian situation, I think that it affected the Israeli public in these elections very simply. The people in Israel, I think, understand that it would be quite difficult to reach an understanding or a peaceful solution with the Palestinians as long as they will continue their one-sidedness moves and actions that basically hinder and might completely stop the peace process as it is quite now. Furthermore, regarding the operation in Gaza, we also have to take in consideration that this operation was a defensive move against an onslaught of rockets and missiles fired by Hamas, the terrorist organization which currently rules the Gaza Strip. And these rockets and missiles threaten more than 500,000 Jews living in cities and settlements within the Israeli border. And I think that the good result of this operation was stopping this onslaught of rockets and missiles firing against Israeli civilians and children. It's simply appalling. Now, regarding your question, I think that since Israel again faces so many challenges, I think it would be very, very difficult to foresee what exactly will he tackle first. I do believe that, of course, it depends on the coalition members that eventually will build a new government of Netanyahu's. And again, I think that the first issue probably will be the social situation in Israel, of course, the economic situation, all the let's say issues and topics that basically conveyed or convinced the most of the Israeli public to get out of their houses and vote. I also want to stress that the past election 2 days ago signifies a record of civilians, Israeli civilians, voting for the past 14 years. More than 63% of the Israeli voters participated in the voting. That's a record that hasn't been seen in Israel for 14 years now.
I'd just like to finish off. We're running out of time, and I know, Rachel, you disagree with Mr. Weiss's position on the war, but I would actually just like to finish off by asking your question over what's going to happen in the days to come. And I know Ariel Sharon once said that in order to become Prime Minister of Israel, you need to be a bit of a snake charmer. You have to please a lot of people. Do you think he's going to take a bit from is Netanyahu going to take a bit from the left, a bit from the right? I mean, how do you see it panning out in the next few days and weeks?
Just to respond very, very briefly to the point about Gaza.
We've a very, very brief time, but if you just quickly respond to that question over the next few days, how do you see it panning out?
Well, over the next few days, Netanyahu is nothing if not a strategist, and he will do his utmost to ensure that he has a strong enough coalition to govern. But if we can take a longer perspective on that, I mean, Israel is going to be stuck with a government that is about managing the situation rather than doing anything to change it. The attack on Gaza was very much managing the situation rather than trying to find any solution to it. Israel is stuck in this position at a time when the entire region is changing. It's increasingly out of touch, and it's going to find that position increasingly problematic.
I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thank you very much, Rachel Shabi, author of Not the Enemy, Israel's Jews from Arab Lands, and from Moscow, our guest Eitan Weiss, First Secretary of the Israeli Embassy in Russia, and Dan Arbel, Scholar in Residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at American University, speaking to us there. Formed Yesh Atid party, which shocked observers by coming second with 19 seats. However, its leader, the former TV presenter Yair Lapid, has demanded reform of a law under which ultra-Orthodox Jewish seminary students can defer military service. The thing is that religious parties in the current governing coalition are strongly opposed to any such changes. This election campaign was marked by a strong showing by the nationalist right party of Habayit HaYehudi, the Jewish Home Party, with its charismatic leader Naftali Bennett, who was most associated with the settler movement. But what kind of government has the election in Israel produced? Is it one that can respond to unhappiness that brought 500,000 people onto the streets in protest against its economic policies? Or will it be a government that will do its utmost to increase control over the occupied Palestinian territories? Well, to discuss this and issues surrounding the election, I'm joined in our London studio by Rachel Shabi, who's a journalist and author of the book Not the Enemy.
You're listening to the Voice of Russia from the heart of London. On weekdays, we broadcast live from 4 p.m. until 8. We'll bring you news, current affairs, features and debate. You can listen to us on digital radio and online. Visit ruvr.co.uk.
Welcome back. You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. Benjamin Netanyahu may be keeping his job as Prime Minister after Israel went to the polls, but his Likud-Beitenu alliance has lost a quarter of its seats in the parliament, or Knesset. With coalition talks still ongoing, his does remain the largest grouping, with 31 seats, but it was a sharp drop from the previous total of 42 for the two parties. Mr. Netanyahu has offered to work with the newly Israel's Jews from Arab Lands. A warm welcome to you, Rachel. We'll be joined very soon by our bureaus in Moscow and in Washington. But I'd just like to get your view initially, Rachel. The horse trading is going on at the moment. Netanyahu, he obviously will stay Prime Minister. But what did you make of the day? We were expecting perhaps the most right-wing coalition in the country's history. That hasn't quite happened, has it?
No, it hasn't. All the polls as well as all the analysts just days before the election, were predicting that there would be a much higher percentage of seats allocated to the right and far right parties. And in fact, it was less than expected, in part because there was a higher turnout of voters in areas that are traditionally not supporters of the right and far right, which in itself is still likely to maintain a very consistent position on the occupied Palestinian territories, which is, to keep them occupied and to keep expanding Jewish settlements.
But on the issue of right and far right, and I take your point that it's difficult to sort of see a left-wing party in all of this. But I mean, is political discourse in Israel doesn't that stop or preclude any kind of leftist tendencies? Given that maybe politicians, they pay lip service to a two-state solution, but when it comes down to it, they don't want to be branded leftist and rendered irrelevant, I suppose.
It's true that left-wing has become, practically an insult in Israel these days. But I do think that part of the responsibility for that does lie with the Israeli left wing itself, in that it has failed. In turn, might have been the result of a ad campaign really encouraging the centre left to go out and vote, as they were identified as the particular proportion of the electorate that were particularly despondent and apathetic about voting. But that all being said, it does look like there is a sort of deceptive prescription of the Israeli Knesset as being split between the left and the far right. And in fact, it's just split between the right and the even further right. And so we are still likely to end up with a coalition that is more far right. Certainly it will have more of a percentage of very settler-friendly politicians than was the case the last time round. And